Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2012-13 Bannan Institute Sacred Texts in the Public Sphere. My name is Teresa Ladrigan-Welpley, and I serve as the Director of Institutes and Spirituality in the Ignatian Center at Santa Clara. The work of the Ignatian Center, as many of you may be familiar, is to advance the distinctively Jesuit Catholic tradition of education here at Santa Clara by promoting the integration of faith, justice, and the intellectual life on campus and in the larger community. We believe this work of integration is deepened and sustained through interdisciplinary engagement, dialogue, and reflection, and that's what the offerings of our Bannan Institutes are designed to foster and promote. So as part of the winter offerings of this year's Bannan Institute, Sacred Texts in the Public Sphere, we're privileged to host today's event, part 2 of a 3-part public learning series entitled Sacred Pixels, Exploring Sacred Text and Digitally Integrated Culture. Today's event on sacred games will explore what elements of the sacred are part of gaming practices, how gaming culture may shape religious belief and practice, as well as the ways in which digitally enabled fantasy, religion, and violence come together, or don't, in relation to sacred texts. To bend the boundaries of time and space, which digital culture often does, this event includes a virtual panelist, as well as 3 reality-enabled panelists, as we call them. And you, the audience, both in person and live streamed, can actually tweet in throughout the event at hashtag #SacredPixelsSCU. So that's hashtag #SacredPixelsSCU. So feel free if you'd like at any point. These tweets will be coming up through the Twitter feeds to my left and to my right, and our panelists will be tending to these comments and questions throughout today. Finally, it's my honor to introduce you to our 2 distinguished curators of this series and panelists in today's event, Elizabeth Drescher and Paul Sukup. Elizabeth Drescher is the author of Tweet If You Heart Jesus, Practicing Church in the Digital Reformation, as well as Click to Save, the Digital Ministry Bible, both on sale today after the event. A writer in the spiritual practices of ordinary believers on and offline at Religious Dispatches and other magazines, she was recently awarded a journalism grant from the Social Science Research Council and the Templeton Foundation to explore the prayer practices of religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, believers who answer none when asked what religion they identify with. Her work will find its way into her next book, Choosing Our Religion, The Spiritual Lives of Religious Nuns, published by Oxford. And Professor Drescher teaches in the Religious Studies and Pastoral Ministry programs here at Santa Clara. Father Paul Sukup of the Society of Jesus is the Pedro Arrupe University Professor in the Communications Department here at Santa Clara. He is an author, editor, or contributor to more than a dozen books, including Out of Eden, 7 Ways God Restores Blocked Communication. Father Sukup has authored dozens of articles on the intersection of religion and media and speaks and teaches widely on the topic. He recently coordinated a symposium at Santa Clara on social communication, sponsored by the Pontifical Council and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, with theologians and media scholars from around the world. Participants began a sustained period of reflection on a media ecology, in which new media enables ideas and practices to circulate widely through contemporary life, forming new environments for religious life. Our curators will themselves introduce our other distinguished panelists, both reality-enabled and virtual. For now, please join me in welcoming them all to today's event.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and welcome again to those of you who are here with, am I not on there? and the technology fails us. Sort of. Is that better? Okay. Okay, so welcome to those of you who are here with us today on the Santa Clara campus and to folks who are joining us online. Again, we encourage you to tweet throughout the conversation today, comments, questions, observations at Sacred Pixels SCU on Twitter, and we'll be sharing those feeds throughout. A little later, a little later if my PowerPoint works. Okay. You'll be meeting our reality-enabled and virtually-enabled panelists who are the authors of these books. I thought today it seemed appropriate, since we're talking about texts, to represent them as their textual selves. And then you'll meet them a little in person. You'll see at various times Sean O'Callaghan popping up at the bottom of the screen, and we'll bring him up a little later. And Paul will be introducing Rachel in just a minute. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how this session connects to the one that we had last week with Douglas Rushcroft, Heidi Campbell, and Lisa Webster. Some of you were here, some of you weren't. And so for those who weren't, a little overview, and for those who were, a little reminder. At that one, we began to explore what the digital landscape looks like in terms of religion and spiritual practice. And we started raising questions about what it means for the sacred to inhabit digital spaces like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. We talked a little bit about gaming, but we're going to really highlight that today, so we pulled back from that. But we were really interested in what it means when somebody or groups of people in digital spaces start to textualize those spaces in ways that resource sacred texts or adapt them or add to them. And in fact, Lisa Webster, who's the senior editor of Religion Dispatches, raised the provocative question of what will happen if or when we might anticipate there's some kind of new religious movement that develops specifically in digital space. Somebody has some kind of epiphany or vision or experience that draws followers to them in that space. Whether that happens or not, people are being actively religious there now, and we know that religion online is not unlike anything else that's now happening in our increasingly mobile, digitally integrated lives. The boundary between what we used to call virtual reality and real life is gone. It's not even blurred. All of us have friends with us in the smartphone, through the smartphones in our pockets and our tablets. And so we started asking the question, what does it mean when our digital practice begins to shape how we understand what is sacred, what constitutes a sacred text, when text is now not just a noun, it's not just an object that has words on a page, but it's also a thing we do, when texting is a verb, and we're reshaping these landscapes. So we spent some time exploring those kinds of questions in the last session. And this time we want to kind of dig deeper and look at a specific instance of the sacred as it's playing out in digital spaces and being textualized or texting itself into religious and spiritual life every day. And that's how we're focusing on gaming. Now, some of you may be gamers. How many of you do online gaming in our local audience? Okay. And those of you who are with us on Twitter can tweet your gaming experience if you'd like. We know that some games are expressly religious and they're designed this way. There are guilds of Christian game designers. And within games like World of Warcraft, there are communities that have and guilds that have explicitly religious practices. I'm going to show you one of the first of those. Just a little clip And this is a Christian game that uses kind of adventurer saga to retell the Jesus story and invite people in it. And those of you who are familiar with the Jesus story will recognize some of the themes. Second. And it's called Adam's Venture.
You're not quite like your dad, are you?
Which is why he sent me to do his field work. Besides, I've never run away from danger before, and I promise to keep you safe. This, I've got to tell my dad.
So this is kind of an Indiana Jonesification of the Jesus story, if you will, and it highlights Christian themes. People go in and they make choices about different narratives that might take them through different salvation stories. There are heathens that need to be converted throughout the story, and there are real questions that might be raised about what it means to translate the Christian Gospels into an online interactive gaming experience, right? But most of the games that people are looking at religious narratives in are not explicitly religiously designed games or Christian games or any other. They're games like World of Warcraft or first-person shooter that are well known for their violent content. And into those games, people bring religious narratives, like in this one on World of Warcraft. Okay, so we see in this one Jesus participating in the violence that defines a lot of the landscapes within World of Warcraft. Yeah, let me just see if I can get back to here. And it raises lots of questions for us. Rachel talks about in the beginning of her book, Godwired, an incident involving Manchester Cathedral in England in 2007 when the Sony company included a landscape with Manchester Cathedral, including interiors, in its game Resistance: The Fall of Man. And people would go into the cathedral and have shoot-'em-up experiences. And the dean of the cathedral and some of the cathedral staff met with the Sony folks. They threatened to sue them, but in fact did not, because it was ruled that it was a public landmark and could be used in the public. But they asked that Sony and other game makers subscribe to what they called digital sacred guidelines, which was the idea that, first of all, they would not use religious sites like churches, temples, mosques in video games without the permission of the authorities of those structures. And secondly, that they would use them as sanctuaries for nonviolence within the gaming context. You will maybe not be surprised to learn that neither Sony nor any other gaming company accepted the proposed guidelines, and in fact, Resistance: Fall of Man was nominated for a video award of some stature in the UK because of its elegant designs in that case. And so there's this constant conversation. This is the video game Insurgency, which includes lots of religious sites in the Middle East, about whether virtual play desecrates religious sites, and whether it's developing a sacralization of violence itself. So to the extent that it's creating a sacred text, is violence becoming sacred within that text? Now that raises important questions that are a lot on people's minds these days in what we're seeing as an increasing, although perhaps constant, culture of violence in the United States and around the world, but certainly recent events have focused our attention on that, on violence in all media, and the question of whether violence in creative fiction, in fantasy texts, can actually cause violence in the real world. So we talked last time about the slippage between the virtual and the real, and there are no boundaries, and people are now saying, yeah, there are no boundaries, because when people get engaged in these violent narratives in digital spaces, they provoke violence. You may know that last week the horror writer Stephen King issued something of a manifesto against gun violence and in support of President Obama's proposals to regulate guns in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shootings. Now, King doesn't design video games, but some of his narratives are in video games. And what he was talking about in this this piece was a book that he wrote a number of years ago called Rage, that involved a high school kid who takes his algebra class hostage, kills the teacher and a number of other people. That book was cited by 4 young mass murderers after they were arrested or after they killed themselves. It was among the background of those folks, and so King pulled the book from publication. And what he said about that was, my book did not break Cox, Pierce, Carneal, or Lucatus, the shooters, or turn them into killers. They found something in my book that spoke to them because they were already broken. Yet I did see Rage, the novel, as a possible accelerant, which is why I pulled it from sale. You don't leave a can of gasoline where a boy with firebug tendencies can lay hand on it. Now, he's talking about a novel, of course, but he's involved extensively in film and some in gaming, and it raises an important question for us. Does this kind of development of new narratives, especially as they're related to religious narratives, create a kind of sacred violence narrative? Are we engaging religion in ways that are changing religion itself and its meaning? Or is this something that is reflective of something in the larger culture rather than a creator of it, or is something else going on? So these are the kinds of questions we'll be exploring today with our panelists. I want to remind you that before Paul introduces our first guest, that in 2 weeks we'll be back here in the evening winding down the series, almost literally unplugging it. We'll talk with Kimberly Knight, who's the founder and pastor of a virtual church in the Second Life community, and with Alex Pang and Tanya Shevitz, who look at ways of honoring the sacred in the body and in human time in our computing practice. So stay tuned to that. But in the meantime, I'm going to let Paul introduce our first guest.
Thank you. We have with us, as we say in what's the term we're using? Reality, augmented reality, actual reality. Rachel Wagner. Rachel teaches religion at Ithaca College, has her degree from Iowa, and has recently published this book, which we've already mentioned to you, God Wired. And in the book, she does a marvelous survey of a lot of the ways in which the digital realm, and particularly the gaming realm, touches on questions of religion. And so rather than my saying a lot about the book, I'm going to allow you to introduce that. I do have some questions that I'll go through, but why don't you just want to maybe say a few words about what led you to this and what you were trying to do with this?
Hi. Yeah, the book was, I don't know, about 3 years in the making. I have a 19-year-old son. And the book's been out, I guess, a year and a half, so it's been finished for about 2 years. So you can do the math and see that he was playing games and writing games as well. So I started thinking about these issues. I was already working in the realm of religion and film and how religion can present a sort of ideal space, space of escape, a space of meaning-making, space of value, construction, and negotiation. So I was already, working in that field. And there are people who are arguing that film can work like ritual. And I thought, well, if that's true, how much more so can video games work like ritual, because they're actually a mode of interactive storytelling and meaning-making, sort of inviting us to imagine ourselves in otherworldly ideal spaces. So that's sort of, the big idea that got me started. And then the book just sort of unfolded over several years.
Okay, and in that, maybe I could ask you, if you would, just to give us a kind of walkthrough. I mean, what are some of the topics that you look at? And I think that's one way, of course, we're used to that in games, sort of what's the game going to present to us? Well, what's the book going to present to us?
Well, the book is arranged by sort of big ideas. What are sort of the big questions and issues that people are talking about? And I realized pretty early on that I couldn't answer or solve most of the problems that I was raising. But I could put all of the smartest people that I was reading in the same room and say, what would they say? If we got a game theorist in the same room with a film theorist and an anthropologist and a sociologist and a theologian, what are they all saying about the same issue, but they're saying it in different places, and sort of see what came of that combination, that synthesis. So in the book, I have a chapter on storytelling and textuality, what happens when you make the Bible an app on your iPod, for example. How is our interaction with that text changed, or any sacred text for that matter? I have a chapter on identity, the self, the plural self, how we have multiple identities online. I have a chapter on community. What does it mean to be with other people? This can be in worship. It can also be games working like religion, because they give us a sense of meaning, purpose, and community. I have a chapter on what I call the ritual game story thing, which I can talk about in a bit if you want me to. And I have a chapter on virtual violence in gaming, which is probably part of the reason that I'm here today. And another chapter on video games as otherworldly journeys. Apocalypses, if you're familiar with the actual genre of apocalypse, it's an otherworldly journey, and video games, turns out, fit the definition that scholars gave for that 2,000-year-old genre. So we've been religious for a really long time. It just takes different forms. And then finally I have a chapter on what's called transmedia, which is sort of the place where all of this comes together, and it's a place that my research is now moving as well, one of the directions. Transmedia is when you have a story world that's manifest in lots of different kinds of media. Harry Potter is the easiest example to see. There are rituals, there are special clothing, there are ritual items, there's a theme park. You can actually inhabit the spaces, you can watch the movies, you can read the books, and so there's a sort of thing that scholars call world building going on there, and that's what transmedia is. And it's one of the places where we can see pop culture emerging, at least functionally speaking, doing the exact same work as full-blown religion. religions. So that's a quick walkthrough.
Good. Thank you. I'm going to pick just a couple of those themes, and then I think maybe later as we open things up for more discussion, people may want to focus in other directions. But one of the things that you tend to do when you set the book up is to argue by analogy. So you'll say in many ways that some of these games, if we just take with games, are like other forms. They're like religion in certain ways. They're like rituals, which are part of religion, or they're like narratives in religion. And on the other hand, you can say that religion is also like some of these other ones. So there's a kind of double analogy going on, or a double direction of that. But if we start just with the very simplest thing in terms of narrative, all of these things have some kind of a narrative which creates them in a religious way. I can make a sweeping statement, and one that I probably wouldn't want to defend, especially with literary and other people here, but to say that much of our narrative has its origins in religion, or religion begins with a narrative, and those early narratives work their way into cultures which determine them, and so on. And so when we have a gaming world, which is a narrative, that makes that connection. Do you see any particular role of narrative? I mean, could we do a game without a narrative, or is that so much a part of who we are?
Right.
That we could not have a religion without a narrative. We could not have a game without a narrative. We could not have, and down the line I'll take identity and some of the other things you're working with. But just kind of your take on narrative, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, that's a huge question. Storytelling is well, one of the chapters is called What is this ritual game story thing? So originally I thought that I could separate ritual from game from story, and I realized very quickly that I couldn't do that. That often we see these three things combined. So even in religious ritual, there's often a story, right, that's associated with the ritual gestures, the ritual experience, the calendrical cycle. There's often a story at root there. And there are often rules that you have to follow, which is sort of where you could bring in the gaming component. And the same thing is true of games, right? Almost any game, and actually video game theorists argue about this a lot. Can a game be a story? There are some people who will say absolutely not. The idea that appeals to me is that, well, it depends on how we look at a story. If we look at a story from sort of after it's finished, then a story in a game is what emerges like the trail of a snail. If you can sort of see where it's been, the story emerges as people make choices in games, and then you can look back and you actually have a story behind you. So in that sense, you can have a story in a game. So when I tell people when looking at any of these phenomena, ritual, a story, or a game, that you'll probably have elements of all three, and the issue is to look at which is ramped up the most, because there's going to be different degrees. Even chess has a very diluted story to it. Right? So that's sort of my take. There are other people who will say differently, and I point to them in the book, and you can think about them. But another key idea, and I like to give people basic tools for thinking about these, and one of the tools is the idea of play, which I think is sort of nesting underneath what you're asking me. And I came across this definition of play. It's proposed by Eric Zimmerman, who's a game theorist. And I'm just going to paraphrase, but he says play is how far you can move the steering wheel and not go off the road. All right? So if you have a video game, there is a story there that most people are going to experience in some kind of way. And, you know, you can't fully go off the road. There are certain choices you cannot make. Right? So if you have a child who's playing a war game, ask them what the story of the game is, or any kind of fighting game. Ask them what the story of the game is and what choices they can make and what choices they can't make. You'll get a sense of the play involved in the game. Now you can apply this to religious storytelling as well, right? Because religious history is filled with people engaging in play. That's what midrash is, after all, right? That's what theology is. It's taking the baseline of a text as we have it received and playing with it. And those theologians that are considered blasphemous, well, they steered off the road. They played a little bit too much. So the stories provide this sort of fixed road for us, this kind of meaning making that we call tradition. Right? And play is the agitation with that tradition. So that happens in religion, right? And it also happens in gaming. And so it's a useful model for thinking about it and for looking at specific examples, too, and asking that question.
In some ways, when you spoke about that trail, it's as though the story or the narrative is retrospective. You know, once we get through it, we look back and we say, well, this is where we've been. But in other ways of thinking about it, when people tell us that story if I am reading a novel or perhaps playing a video
Yeah.
game, somebody has already made the trail. They've set that road, and I'm not supposed to
Yes.
steer off it.
Right.
And so now we have a collaborative component.
Right.
Yes.
I don't tell the story myself, I
Right.
tell it for someone else. Or I take part in their story.
Or in multiplayer games, of course, then we have
Right.
multiple people participating in the stories, which has that midrashic quality that you mentioned, but is otherwise unfamiliar to us in modern textualizing.
I'm going to just ask you if you would, because we have a great variety of students, including some in my class here who are here for the communication part, not for the religious studies part. Would you like to say what midrash is?
Oh, go, Rachel.
All right. When you're reading a text, usually the Bible in this case, there are gaps in it, right? You can't know everything that ever happened to a character, otherwise the text would never end.
So if you take the Moses story, for example.
You take the Moses story, for example. You can find narrative gaps, right? Places where time passes and we don't actually know what happened. Midrash is sort of imagining what might have happened in that space. So it's sort of narrative play, and it happens in all kinds of forms.
And as midrashic texts in particular, but there are lots of them, developed over time, part of that, the interactivity of the midrash is there's a central text, the Moses story from Exodus, and different religious authorities commenting on them over time, which is why you'll hear medievalists, for example, argue that they invented hypertexting, right? Because there's a central text, and if they could have clicked, there are some images that tell you a little bit more about it, and then there's this person's opinion and that person's opinion and so on. So it's both filling in the gaps and doing that from multiple perspectives at the same time in the same text, and that is very much like a gaming experience.
Right, but I think sort of another interesting angle here to sort of move back in the other direction is that there are certain stories that we want to unfold exactly the same way every time, right? The Jesus story, for example. Yeah, so that road is relatively fixed. And so those gamers, right, who want to, do a sort of interactive form of blasphemy, they alter that story. They swerve off the road intentionally. And then also, on the other hand, if you look at some, Christian-produced children's games, my favorite is Bible Champions, you will actually find people honoring the adherence to that story. So the play comes in a child character, not from the Bible, who runs around collecting faith, hope, and love tokens, and then she's rewarded with a reading of the text intact. So you can actually see it in motion within the game itself. And so, also you can think about, elements of fate and predestination and why certain forms of media are sort of less likely to be provocative. A Jesus video game, for example, is a lot more likely to be problematic than a Jesus movie. Not that you can't make a problematic Jesus movie, right? But it's because the story is fixed, you have greater control over its reception and a greater likelihood that the person experiencing that film will experience it as a retelling of a fixed story, and therefore theological conviction.
Go ahead.
No, partly I'm prompted by one of the questions that's come in on our Twitter feed, which has to do with the responsibility that a storyteller or a game maker would have. I mean, what responsibility do we have to an existing text? You talked about the Jesus story is going to, of course, be somewhat fixed. But if again, I use your analogy, if we take it not just religious games, but let's say, I'm doing a Harry Potter game. Do I have a responsibility to stay close to the received text?
And I'm going to just add on to that one, just to think, you mentioned before, in this steering off the road, there are moments where that veers into blasphemy. Right?
I'm going to come back to that.
Right, exactly. And that's so provocative, and it's going to lead us in another direction as well. But yeah, to what extent do designers have to be or should they, that's a tough word, be responsible for putting hard boundaries on the road?
Yeah, this is where our American context becomes so rough and thorny, right? People will argue freedom of speech or freedom of creation. But I think what I can do is I can give you another of my sort of favorite tools that may sort of help enrich this question even more. And I've never actually applied it to the Jesus story, so it'll be interesting to see how this works. But game theorists talk about something called the magic circle. And this is a really key idea, I think, for understanding games and their intersection with reality as we know it. And it also you'll see as obvious implications for discussions of violence, which is where we're going to go eventually. But the magic circle is the idea that when I play a game, I enter into a magic circle that's completely different from the real world, and therefore anything that happens there happens only in the game because it's a game. Right? And it's framed as such. So some people will say, well, I can perform this blasphemy because it's just a game. It's within the magic circle. It's all in fun. You know, lots of people have criticized this theory. But one of the things I ask people when they're looking at games is to ask how related the magic circle, the world of the game, is to our real world. And if that world within that game is so removed from our own, it's fantasy, you know, it's orcs, it's trolls, right? It's less likely, not completely unlikely, but less likely that there's going to be spillover into your everyday life because you're not going to see an orc or a troll as you walk around. But if that game is replaying, say, recent events in Iraq and scripting them into an us versus them binary, right, of people you don't shoot and people you do, and it's saying this is how the real world is, let me give you news and let me report to you through this game what life is like, that's a very thin magic circle. And that's where I think we come into some real danger, right? And so, I mean, I can't necessarily answer the question. I think that game designers should be respectful. I do. But they may choose not to be.
Well, I mean, in their moments, you know, there are, throughout World of Warcraft, for example, a whole bunch of zombie Jesuses, right? And sometimes zombie Jesus is out shooting up pagan trolls. Sometimes zombie Jesus is out creating other zombies to take over another part of the World of Warcraft landscape. Zombie Jesus, you know, there's the problematic of zombie Jesus in the first place, right, which is a theological argument, right? So there's that. And then there's the action. You know, a game designer can't anticipate that, right? If you're creating an open-ended space, a game designer can't anticipate that that this religious narrative is going to be adapted within this space, but that designer can anticipate that that character will use the resources that are provided within the game, right? The different wands and knives and guns and bombs and all of those kinds of things. So it's hard to know how responsibility plays out in that case.
Well, and also, again, you know, especially for people who you know, are interested in how gamers work and want to ask, you know, critical questions of gamers that they know, then, you know, you might ask, well, think about whether or not it's a game or a world, first of all. So how tightly scripted is that experience? And if it's a first-person shooter, it's probably fairly tightly scripted, and that road is probably hard to veer very much from it. But if it's an online world, and World of Warcraft has some of these components, right, you're given sort of props and tools and maybe some quests, so there's some guidance but not as much. And the world of Second Life, which is almost completely user created, you're simply given props and tools, so what you do in there is much more up to you. So again, these are critical questions that you have to ask of the individual experiencing it, you know, of the virtual space in which you're entering, and they're going to have different dangers, right? You're going to have to worry about the game about Iraq a lot more, or in a different way at least, than you're going to have to worry about World of Warcraft.
Right.
So you're going to ask different
maybe.
questions.
I mean, this seems to be a good moment for us to bring in our digital panelist, Sean O'Callaghan, and I wonder if we can get him up on the Skype for a moment, because Sean has been working with some of these very questions, and we'll just make sure he's here with us.
Hi, Elizabeth. Can you see me?
I can. Welcome to Santa Clara.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi.
Hi, we're sorry we can't share our warm, sunny day with you, but you have the warmth of our hearts that you're with us. So let me just take a second to introduce you. Dr. Sean O'Callahan, who has a bit of a cold today, he's told us, so bear with him, is Assistant Professor of Religious and Theological Studies at Salve Regina University in Rhode Island. He has a PhD in Systematic Theology from the University of Liverpool. Prior to his move to the United States this year, Sean was a lecturer at Lancaster University in the UK. He's got a particular interest in cyber spirituality and the ways in which cyberspace has impacted the sacred landscape, resulting in both the emergence of new forms of spiritual and practice and the transformation of traditional religious expressions. He's currently researching the use of cyberspace and technology by millennialist groups, hyper-real spiritualities, and groups which engage in religiously inspired violence. And we're so happy to have you here today. Sean, Sean, you presented a paper last summer at NYU in which you explored the case of Anders Breivik, the Norwegian militant nationalist who in July of 2011 set off a bomb in Oslo and then traveled to an island outside of Oslo where he killed 69 people, mostly teenagers, and wounded a number more before he surrendered to authorities. You argued in the paper that Breivik's violent rampage and subsequent trial was a performance, supported in part at least by narratives he developed in World of Warcraft. Can you say more about the connection between gaming and violence in the case of Breivik? And I think you probably know this is going to lead us to Sandy Hook pretty quickly.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Can I just apologize for my voice, first of all? I've had a bad chest infection. I'm really struggling with it, so it might, disappear every now and again. Breivik played games a lot. He played World of Warcraft, Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, and he claimed that he played Call of Duty especially to perfect his targeting for his shooting spree. He used holographic sights to perfect his aim, and actually when he carried out the shooting on the island, when he traversed the island killing 69 young people there, he expressed in his trial over and over again, he expressed surprise at how they reacted to him. They didn't react as he expected. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that he played the game so much to prepare himself. Obviously, in real life, the young people didn't behave as the characters in the game, so quite often they froze, they didn't try to run away from him, they didn't try to fight back, and so on. He says that he played World of Warcraft simply as a hobby. He claims that there's no connection between his playing of that game and these subsequent violence, but at the same time he played it for 16 hours a day for a whole year. He took a year out of his life, and every day for that year he played the game for 60 hours, and he incorporates characters from that game into the manifesto which he published online just before he went on his killing spree, just before he set off the bomb in Oslo, which preceded the killing spree. He had set up a Facebook page. He had about 1,000 friends on this page, and then he emailed out his manifesto, which basically is a 1,500-page rationale for his violence, and kind of he explains his anti-Islamic stance there, and he incorporates many elements of the game, many characters from the game into that online manifesto.
You know what, Sean, though, you mentioned that that Breivik was anti-Islamic. He has a particular kind of Christian nationalism. How does that factor into the gaming persona that you see him developing?
Yeah, well, Breivik was very much a cultural Christian. He doesn't claim anywhere to be a practicing Christian. He's not a doctrinal Christian. He's not interested in that. He's interested in the sacred in society itself. So he sees Western society, Western Christian culture as being sacred. Mostly, I think, because it's not Islam. For him, he has a very, very big problem with Islam. So he highlights what he sees as the sacredness of Christian culture, and that Christian culture is the culture most suited to the West. He doesn't appear to have any personal sense of the sacred. So his Christianity is a kind of a hook on which he hangs mostly his hatred of Islam. But interesting that from the game world of Warcraft, he particularly homes in on the character of the knight. There's a character there called the Justiciar knight, sorry. And he particularly homes in on this character as a kind of exemplar of the sacred, an exemplar of the Christian sacred, of the Knights Templar who protect the sacredness of the West, the sacredness of Christian nations from Islam. So, in a sense, the game for him becomes a kind of a sacred space in which he finds a sacred character with which he identifies. And then he actually takes on the persona of that character himself.
Mm-hmm. Sean, I'm going to...
The defender of the West. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to let Rachel and Paul come into the conversation. But, you know, a fairly unsophisticated read, I would say, of what you've written and the way that you've studied Breivik. And we hear this echoed, you know, in a lot of the conversation about Sandy Hook now and other gun rampages that are associated with gaming would say, if Breivik had not been doing World of Warcraft, he would not have had this character on which to hang this nationalist Christian ideology. He wouldn't have had the opportunity to develop what he thought of as a skill set to implement this apocalyptic vision that he has. That in effect, the gaming causes this behavior or enables it. I mean, in the Stephen King language, is an accelerant for it. Do you see it that way?
No, I see it more in terms of what's called hyper-real spirituality. And hyper-real spirituality is basically a kind of a spirituality which comes out of a narrative of some kind. It's a fictional narrative which is unreal, obviously, but which reflects reality, and then somehow for the person it becomes real. And I think if Breivik hadn't found it in computer games, he would probably, if he had looked hard enough, he would have found it somewhere else. He would have found it in film, he might have found it in a book form, because he was interested in that whole fantasy element. I think he made very strategic use of computer games. Basically, I don't think the games made him kill. I think the killer in him used the games to help him to kind of augment and supplement what he was actually trying to do. So, in a sense, the games helped him to formulate a persona, but I think he would have formed that persona perhaps elsewhere if he didn't have the games.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it strikes me that we're talking on issues, and Rachel, you touched this on well, about identity. Mm-hmm. And typically, you know, we gather our identity from multiple sources, and some of them are more powerful. So for some people, religious identity becomes a very strong area of their core identity. For others, it may be an identity that is rooted in their work, or it could be in some other life activity. Mm-hmm. And so, Rachel, you've done more work on identity coming from gaming. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as a plausible kind of thing? This assembly of bits and pieces from different places?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I never connected these two in this way either, but I think it's a nice juxtaposition for me, Basically, you're seeing a new research trajectory be born. So in the book, I have a chapter on the iPod self, which is about plural selves. And if you look at your smartphone, you actually get a visual of all the different pieces of yourself that you're carrying around, all the different identities that we present ourselves in different ways. And so we're sort of plural in that respect, right? And we use media as one of the ways that we create our identities. But the other piece that I'm sort of carrying in tension with that is what I mentioned earlier, is the sort of binaries that are introduced, especially by first-person shooter video games, and to a certain extent World of Warcraft as well, where you see tribal identities. You identify yourself with this group of people opposed to this other group of people. And to put it simply, I think that because the world itself is messy, there's lots of different people who believe lots of different things, right? That it's very comforting to enter into these spaces that are scripted for us, where we know who our people are and we can reject those other people. And that, I think, is dangerous, not insofar as I think that everyone's going to go out and pick up a gun and shoot those people that are the other, but they might be less likely to get to know them. They might be less curious. So I think that that sort of pattern of binaries, by identifying yourself in distinction from others, I think that that's one response to our contemporary world, and it can be a problematic one if it closes you off from dialogue.
Yes, Sean, go ahead, Paul.
No, I was actually going to ask Sean for a comment on the same kind of thing. There is a psychological theory called partial inclusion, which says that we are at any one moment members of multiple groups. And we are partially included in them, but then as we draw closer to them, we might be completely included and then back out. So I'll use the religious example. If I'm in church on Sunday, I'm completely included in that group. But when I leave church, part of me is still in that. And I'm here at the university, I'm fully included at the university, but when I leave the office or the classroom, I'm still partially. And Sean, it strikes me that what you're describing is where this partial inclusion takes over a person's life, and not just the game playing.
Yeah, I suppose one of the features of cyberspace is that it enables us to be whoever we want to be. You know, we are a number of different people in cyberspace. I mean, I've got 11 different email addresses, and I use each email address for different things. And in a sense, I'm a different person in each one. And, you know, when we're online reacting to people, when we're discussing things on forums, we take on maybe different personas. And Breivik, I think he kind of lost himself in gaming, lost his own identity. Now, he was a particular, I think Breivik is a particular kind of character. He's very childish, he's very immature. That's what comes across from looking at him in his trial. He's someone who's had a difficult past, and so somewhere he's had some tremendous identity issues. So for someone in particular, the romanticism of the Knights Templar, of the Justiciar Knight, and so on, that just took him over, and that drew him in, and he identified so closely with that persona that as he traversed that island, he actually saw himself, imagined himself to be the knight who was carrying out, you know, this kind of crusader-type killing on behalf of the Christian faith, or the Christian West.
Yeah, I mean, I have to wonder, you know, of course Breivik is an extreme case. Of course, you know, these other shooters are extreme cases. But, you know, we have legislators introducing legislation to study violence in gaming in particular. Rachel's highlighted the binary choices, which are, of course, the coding basis of these realities, right? They're set up. It's easier to make them happen if you're always choosing one thing or another. And that raises the question of, you know, I think we can all say it's unlikely that a sizable majority of people who do a lot of online gaming are going to become violent. But is there something about that particular mode of engagement with a fantasy text and an interactive experience that, and again I'm going to use Stephen King's word, that is an accelerant? Is there something in the nature of gaming itself? And when you add to that fire religious narratives, does it make it more likely that violence is going to emerge because you're doing this, you know, Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Muslim binary that has a particular historical combustibility, if you will. I mean, I guess I'm going to ask that as a general question, but Sean, why don't you go ahead and start?
Yeah, I think so. I suppose the interactive nature of it enables you to more easily relate to characters that you're engaging with in the game itself. So you're actually relating to them, not exactly as you would relate to real people, but if you're somebody who, like Breivik, had cut himself off from the outside world, he cut himself off from his friends, he lived almost like a monk or a hermit for a very long time, then I think you do lose that sense of perspective. And as a result, that the online world becomes everything to you.
You know, I think, I mean, I'm thinking about what you're saying about him being isolated, and I'm thinking about the appeal of ordered otherworldly spaces, especially if they're computer programmed, because we think, oh, well, you know, we know that makes sense, we know there are rules, we know there are winners and losers, and, you know, the appeal of entering into that kind of space. And, you know, obviously the question of mental illness is right there, right? If someone is mentally ill, they're a lot more likely to let that magic circle become permeable because they're already having trouble sort of figuring out what reality is. So I think that's sort of an obvious thing to point out. But in a larger sense, I think that the more we retreat into screen spaces, and you know, there are a lot of people who say this, I'm not the only one, that we lose a sense of community. So we perhaps don't notice when someone's mentally ill, or we don't notice when someone is lonely, and so those people are going to be more drawn to these fantasy imaginary spaces. So I would actually say that the problem is not video games per se, although perhaps, you know, like I said, I think those binaries are dangerous for all kinds of reasons, even for mentally well people. I think they can encourage dangerous perspectives. But I think the larger issue is cultural, that we're not being critical, and I mean that just in sort of a self-aware way, of the role of screens in our lives and the magic that they hold for us and the price that we might be paying by not noticing the people right next to us.
Yeah.
I'm going to put my communication professor hat on because it strikes me that there are two sets of research coming out of communication. The most researched area in communication has been violence. Lots of grant money available for that, starting in the early 1960s. And one research paradigm can look at this and say, and you look at all of these studies over 40 or 50 years, some violent content causes some people to become violent some of the time under some circumstances. The danger is, how do you define each of those some? Because it is very difficult to generalize the audience. However, there's another perspective, and we've hinted at it, and it's the perspective, and Teresa, you gave me a little hint about that, about the media ecology, which says that if we think of this as an ecosystem, there are different things that are going on in this, and we cannot ignore the nature of the type of communication. So game playing has an impact, whatever the content of the game might be. You describe it as, you know, the road, for example, we stay within that. If we live our lives as though there is a road that we have to stay in the ruts on, that's going to change the way we think. And somebody who thinks, you know, in a way about violence will get channeled more deeply, perhaps, into that. That there is an impact from what we do. The fact that we are either face-to-face creates a certain human experience. Sean, with you, you know, on Skype, there's a different human experience. All of these things have to become part of it.
Yeah, I want to suggest, though, that there may be something different about gaming experientially because of the way that, you know, everybody here on campus, right, sees our students and some of our faculty walking around, looking down, texting, and You know, I was nearly wiped out last fall by a dude on a skateboard texting. Although I thought he was remarkably skilled to be able to make it that far. But in any case, that kind of, you know, the behavior I'm doing on my smartphone isn't going to necessarily invite me to wholly detach from the plural realities around me, from the different modes of reality. And there is something, you know, when you talk about Breivik being on for 16 hours a day, and we hear these stories all the time about kids who have game addiction and camps, you know, for them to be deprogrammed on that. There's something about your phrase, the entering the screen, right, that's, kind of a kind of being captured by the experience that seems to me different in kind, maybe.
I can relate that to stories.
Ooh.
Yeah, which is where we started.
Yeah.
So stories, right, are generally have a sort of fixed structure to them, and they we're drawn to them in part because, well, if we go to a movie, we expect it to have a happy ending. Sometimes genres disrupt our expectations, but often they don't. And if we play a video game, we know there's going to be a winner, and we know there's going to be a loser, and we know how to win. You win by killing all those other people, right, who you've been told are enemies. And so if what you're suggesting, Elizabeth, is so, then Breivik may have been drawn to the sort of completeness of the story component
right.
that he would experience in the games. And, you know, it's a quasi-messianic tale, right? But it's endowed with this really deep violence that world peace will only come through killing. And actually, this is just my personal opinion, but that is one of the things that disturbs me personally the most about some of the gun rhetoric that's coming out now, is the language of good guys and bad guys, and that the good guys need guns because they need to kill the bad guys with guns. And things are a lot more complicated than that, and I understand that, but anytime I hear that kind of binary language, I get very uncomfortable for this reason, because I worry that there's a mythology, that there's a new cultural story, right, of winners and losers, and life as a game, and violence as the means to win it, that I see emerging and being retold again and again and again in many of our different modes of media.
Well, it suggests to me, as the field narrows, whether it's through some kind of rhetoric or through the screen time, when we think about the sacred, you know, we talked last time about, you know, people using the Ignatian press 3-minute retreat during the day as a moment to just kind of get in touch with their spiritual selves, or going onto a Facebook page where you pray to people, or into Bible 360 and all of those kinds of things as remarkably nurturing things for people that allow them to bring their spirituality into everyday life. What seems different in gaming is that religion becomes a prop. Right? So, or that it can, right? So that it's not a meaning-making system that is being enlarged or expanded into other spaces, but that it becomes, you know, in the zombie Jesus stories, or the Jesus video coming into World of Warcraft that we saw, that becomes a prop that participates not in its own sacred narrative, but in the narrative of the video game, right?
Or it becomes a means to sort people.
Yeah, but that's part of the video game narrative, is sorting people, right?
One of the other things that strikes me, if we bring this back to the sacred or to the religion, there is the ritual components of all of this. And then there are also the components when you talk about the magic circle. One of the things that will come up in communication study is, how do we know when we are playing and when we are not? In fact, if you look even at animals, and you look at two dogs who are playing, it looks a lot like those dogs are fighting. How do the dogs know that it's a play and not a fight? And the same thing with us. I mean, when we use our language, sometimes we will say things to another person in jest that sound a lot like an insult. And so I think the same thing, you know, we can apply here. How do we know it's a game, and how do we know it's not? And then especially if you go back into this whole blasphemy kind of thing, this is not new. The Crusaders who were heading off to Jerusalem in the medieval period, in some ways were blaspheming, because they took part of Christianity and they made it into something that it was not. to satisfy something that was outside of themselves. So again, it's that question of how do you know when you crossed the boundary? You talk about the circle, the magic circle, but it's a basic communication kind of thing. How do I know when I'm playing? How do I know when I'm not?
And I want to just invite Sean into that. If you have any thoughts about that or questions for Rachel or Paul.
Well, I was just thinking about Breivik there, and listening to what Rachel said earlier on about the vulnerability of some people involved in gaming. And I was just thinking about the way he compartmentalized his life. That's something very, very interesting about him. He compartmentalized his life really well, really skillfully. Not just the fact that he spent a lot of time online, but even online, a lot of those with whom he was in communication didn't know what was going on in his life. They were very, very surprised. Obviously, the people he was in contact with in the gaming world were incredibly surprised when he turned out to be the killer in Oslo. And I just wonder if that is a feature now, like you spoke earlier on, Elizabeth, about the guy who's texting as he's skateboarding and he's completely involved in that. And if we now just put our lives into little boxes, we've got so many little boxes, and as a result, there's no overlap sometimes between those boxes, and only maybe one or two people, or perhaps no one at all, knows what's going on in our whole lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that perhaps that's a tremendous danger. We lose that community aspect because we are fragmented.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Actually, the community aspect is a nice suggestion that perhaps we should take questions from the community that's here in the room. And so if anyone does have questions, please let me know, and I'll try to bring the microphone to you, and then we'll pan the camera, Sean, so you can see who's asking the question as well. Okay.
Hi, everybody. My name is Amy Moiso. I'm one of the campus ministers here. And I'm curious about how the gaming is relating to issues of gender and to race. Because what we've seen in terms of how it expresses itself in culture in violence is that it tends to be white men, white young men, who are acting out in these ways. And I'm wondering if there's been research into sort of gaming and gender or gaming and race, and how that relates to religion and all the other things we've been discussing.
Sean, do you have thoughts on that?
I have to say that's not an area I've looked at too deeply, so it's not an area I would have any strong views about. But just Breivik himself was a strong anti-feminist.
Yeah.
That's something that strongly comes across in his rhetoric, strongly anti-Islam, extremely racist guy. But then he's just one single example. But I don't know enough to speak widely about it. Maybe Rachel knows more.
Just a little, not much. It's an emerging field of study. People are just beginning to ask really good questions about video games at all, and so that's sort of the second wave. But I mean, you can think about representation of self on screen, and if you look at the choices that you have for avatars in games, they're most often buff white men, or
they're women with exaggerated features that would be attractive to white buff men.
Exactly. So there are people looking at sort of voyeur theory there. So men might choose to play as a woman so that they can watch her on screen, and and so the issue of placement of self in relationship to that figure. And this isn't an answer, but I think it's a really interesting question. One of the things I'm interested in and haven't done any work in yet is the export of American games around the world, so that they're getting games that are 5-6 years old, systems that we've discarded that are then sold cheaply around the world. So you can have someone in Africa who doesn't have running water or electricity, but their youth are playing video games as buff white men, using violence to make the world a better place. So I think there's a lot of really rich questions there. I haven't heard anyone talk about the causal relationship. I mean, and actually, maybe this says that our young white men feel kind of lost. I mean, maybe it's, they're being sort of drawn into these, and not all of them. For some of them, it is fun, and for some of them, it's harmless, and some of them are able to lead perfectly productive lives. You can't generalize about this, but maybe just paying attention.
The reason why I was curious about it is because it strikes me that this has a lot to do with shifting power, too, and where people feel like they have some measure of power, perhaps in where things around them are shifting from those boundaries that have been true in the past. And race and gender are part of that.
Absolutely. I was talking about sort of the situation we're in today, where we're dealing with lots of different voices, lots of different modes of belief, and issues of diversity, which, is sort of first and foremost in education right now, issues of who am I? And I think this is true for both genders, but perhaps especially for young white men. Who am I, and how do I find my identity and meaning? And here's a game that's going to give me a fixed sense of identity. I can feel powerful here, even if I don't know if I'm going to get a job, right, when I graduate.
And I can draw on the religious narratives that reinforced that. I don't know of anywhere in the gaming world that you're seeing religious narratives that would be identified as progressive pluralist narratives, right? I mean, they're extreme religious narratives. So it goes into that sense of wanting to develop, an identity grounded in certainty, rather than doubt, exploration, and all of those kinds of things that are critical parts of religious seeking, even within traditional religions, right? We're meant to explore doubt. We're meant to explore those kinds of questions in most traditions, and to think about engagement with other religions that gets shut down in the way the technology shapes the narrative, and then people who are attracted to that can latch onto it.
Yeah, I don't know if this helps to answer the question, but Breivik strongly exaggerated his masculine qualities and chose characters which were extremely masculine and heroic, and at the same time, within his manifesto, he laments the feminization of Norway and is strongly anti-feminist, actually, in his writing. So I think, perhaps gaming gave him the opportunity maybe to explore the masculine side a little bit more, because he felt very, very threatened by the feminine.
Hello, my name is Christopher Pioli. I graduated from Santa Clara in 2007 and with a computer science degree, and I've been kind of working off and on in the game development industry for the past several years or so. And I just wanted to answer your question. It's actually kind of funny in one aspect, because what you're asking is really a large can of worms that people within the industry have slowly begun confronting. And I think there are two spaces of this issue. There are the gamers themselves and the fans, and then there are the game developers and the game news agencies, and not marketers, but actual people who cover the industry. And there's nothing really, not really. I mean, it's a male-dominated field. There all are women in the field of development, but the antipathy and the apprehension that a lot of male gamers feel towards women can't be understated. And I also think that's because a lot of the presence that women have had mostly have been in the form of those scantily clad characters, and also at expositions. The term booth babe is a derogatory term for attractive women who've been promoting these materials, and these news agencies, they go out, they take photographs of the games, and there happen to be scantily clad women there, and this sort of happens year after year, and it reinforces this sort of identity of women.
And then we have a Twitter question, Paul.
Hi, I'm Ricky Manalo, lecturer at the Religion Department. A question I have is, how do you factor in the, well, I guess the fact or interpretation that the Bible itself is violent? from, I mean, you may have talked about this in the first session, I wasn't here, but, you know, from, I mean, from creation to Cain and Abel to innocence, the holy innocence and all that. So I just wonder whether that's another dynamic going on. You use the metaphor of driving on the road and how we negotiate the ethical behaviors of boundaries. Well, what if that road is already square one violent? I mean, does that not, what you were saying, Elizabeth, not only does technology reshape the biblical narrative or religion, but it's also vice versa. So how do you put that into this, that component into this discussion?
Should I take that one?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't have to. It's a very good question. Well, I think the first thing I would say is that the road of interpretation is more one based in tradition rather than what the text itself actually says. But with that said, I think that some of the richest interpretations are those that acknowledge the multiple storylines there and enable the text to become multiple again, because you're absolutely right. There should be self-reflective reading of it, and of course there are people who will lift up those violent elements and say, here is my justification within my religion for living my religion like a game, which is the reverse. And of course that has happened throughout history. He was talking about the Crusades as an example, right, that people can live their religion like a game with winners and losers, and heaven being sort of the end game, the purpose toward which you're moving. So I would never want to deny that that's part of tradition, and that we should be critical about all of the stories, I think, that shape our lives.
Mm-hmm. Sean, did you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think there's always been that link between religion and violence, and I think partly that's because, just thinking about Christianity and Islam, they're both very expansionist faiths. So that desire to expand, that desire to take territory manifests itself sometimes not just in taking physical territory, but in taking metaphysical territory as well, and taking the world of speech, narrative, and so on. So violence in religion is not just physical violence. It manifests itself in many, many different ways. And it's a paradox, you know, that something which should be so peaceful has within it those tremendous deeds of violence.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm sorry. I happened when I was preparing for this to read some gaming blogs where people were talking about religious participation, and there were a couple that talked about this is what religion is, and the bloggers had a sense that they were in the way of a lot of people who are anti-religious, exposing the violent truth of religion through doing this. This was one guy was using a Jesus, Jesus was a savage murderer, that was his word, who was going out killing and then going to kill himself, come back and keep killing again. Right, and his argument was that exists in religion, and I think, as Rachel said, part of the problem there has to do with the flattening of interpretation, right? If we're reading everything in a very literal way, and we've done that, for the last 500 years or so in terms of Scripture, how do we get to this more plural understanding, both of our religious traditions and its sacred texts, and of our own practice and engagements? And I think that one of our Twitter questioners asked, "Are we scripting black and white behavior that prevents gray dialogue in games?" And I think that's exactly the challenge that those of us who are concerned about how religion is participating in new media spaces need to address. How do we get to those in-between spaces in our own traditions? How do we get to a deeper exploration of the various grays that exist across the landscape? We have time for one last. No, are you questioning?
I was going to have a question, but I will yield.
No.
My name is Mick McCarthy. I'm from the Ignatian Center, and I'm going to ask a question that's admittedly unfair because you're not mental health professionals, right? But you did raise the question of mental illness, and it's part of the larger social conversation. And as an audience member, you can ask any question that you like, right? But I'm wondering if you take your wonderful description of a game as basically the road off which you cannot veer. Is there a parallel between that and what we call mental health, right?
What a great question.
And it's kind of an interesting thing, because when we think about mental health, we think of neurological deficiencies. We've come to the point of understanding the brain well enough that we talk about neurological deficiencies, et cetera. But there is also a narrative component to mental health too.
Sure.
And so I raise that more as a question, understanding that it's a very difficult thing to answer, but I think it's a really important.
Well, I mean, I'm going to let Sean respond to this, but it's a cognitive mapping question, right? So is gaming inviting a kind of cognitive mapping that drives, to use Rachel's metaphor, into mental instability?
It's a really, I think it's a very difficult question to answer. Looking at Breivik himself, I think I don't think gaming necessarily contributed to any breakdown of mental health there, but he brought his mental health problems to to cyberspace and found there the means to create some kind of a fantasy world for himself. But I don't think the online world itself had any role in creating those mental health problems that he actually had. But I think, it just helped him to find a space to create some kind of a persona in which he could live. So in a sense, he was living out a life as someone else, kind of a split personality. But I think his mental health issues are kind of separate from his online life.
I want to suggest, we're almost out of time. I want to suggest that that's certainly a place that we need to study more. And people have looked at that with religion as well, right? Does religion create a narrative that either helps or harms mental health and wellness generally? All of these questions are really provocative and productive, and I'm so grateful, Sean, that you were able to join us from afar, that digital technology has allowed us that, and that Rachel, you were able to join us in your reality-enabled state here. I really appreciate that. We're moving actually in the direction that will take us right into our next conversation. And that really is, we're going to look at this question of worship in digital spaces. Again, Kimberly Knight has dealt fairly provocatively with questions of Eucharist in Second Life and what that might mean. So, and that's going to move us into what happens with real bodies, or with the real. Alex Pang and Tanya Shevitz will be talking with us about strategies for living as embodied beings in relation to technology of the sort that Rachel has called for as well. So thank you all for great questions, and we appreciate you being there. I'm going to turn it back over to Teresa.
Thank you very much. Thank you, each of you, and to you, Sean, as well, for just you've broadened our landscape. I know for myself, I feel updated as well, from Super Mario to the buff Jesus. Like I have gone leaps and bounds, but also kind of stirred questions within me and within this community that we will be exploring in the days to come. And that next event is on February 13th, which is Ash Wednesday, as we merge kind of sacred worlds here at Santa Clara with these questions of digital culture. So we hope that you can join us for that. And you also have at your place some evaluation cards. This is really an experimental form for us with multimedia and in this kind of roundtable format. So if you can please give us your feedback, it really helps us as we're imagining the Institute into the coming years. So we want to end just by thanking very much each of our speakers, reality-enabled and virtual, and for all of you for being with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Rachel, this is for you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, again, Sean, thank you.
Thank you.
One day we may meet in person, or
And one will be going
Okay.
to Sean.
okay.
at
Take care.
Bannan meeting.
Bye.
So,
Bye.